So the inevitable has happened. The New York Mets have hired Buck Showalter to be their next manager. Going to talk about that on this special weekend episode of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans who are listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Locked On Mets is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Now, on this special edition of Locked On Mets, we have an obvious thing to discuss. The Mets now have a manager, Buck Showalter. If you've been listening to this show, it seemed like this was the obvious choice. I've been talking about it for a few weeks, going back to when I had Pat Ragazza on. I believe that was last week. This week on Friday's show, I discussed how this still seemed like the clear front runner in this job hunt. Joe Espada and Matt Quatraro got their final interviews with Steve Cohen. The Mets made the process look good, but at the end of the day, Buck Showalter got in front of Steve Cohen on Friday, and they came together on a 3-year contract. He is the Mets manager. Going to talk about that throughout this episode of Locked On Mets. Before we get into any of that, though, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing about the Mets at justbaseball.com. So when it comes to this decision, like I said previously, this seemed like the obvious choice. And as much as we can dive into the type of manager they could have hired and what Joe Espada would have been, and really get into the nuts and bolts of this, we sort of saw this one coming, right? It seemed a little too obvious, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with the Mets going with the slam dunk obvious choice, even if it's not cutting edge, even if it's not the cool, analytically driven move to get the next hot manager. You got a guy who's done the job. And if you're trying to win now and you are putting together a roster that is as win now as it gets, when you have Starling Marte getting big money at his age, when Max Scherzer gets that $130 million contract in his late 30s, you are trying to win now. And what cuts out the most variables? Getting the veteran manager. Because as much as we think Joe Espada will be a great manager, as much as some believe Matt Quatraro is the next Bob Melvin, maybe, those are maybes. And it's still a rookie manager in New York City, a market that they're unfamiliar with. Buck Showalter has managed in this market. He's not going to get fazed by anything. He's not going to get fazed by star players. He has dealt with a million big egos throughout his entire career. He worked for George Steinbrenner, whether that worked out great or not. He did have that experience to draw from, or he does have that experience to draw from. And now he's going to work for Steve Cohen. And I think when you, again, look at the complexities of this job, similar to Billy Epler and how he fits as the Mets GM, because he had this previous experience to draw on with the Angels, having a rich owner, knowing how to spend, knowing the relationships you need to pull on from agents and how to try to build short term. Even if it didn't work for Billy Epler the first time, he still has experience of trying before, knowing what didn't work, and now he's trying again with Buck Showalter. You are getting a manager who has seen it all before. It's that simple. And so I can't criticize the hire by any stretch of the imagination, because if you're trying to win now, there is not a more win now manager that was on the market than Buck Showalter. And I don't care about his failings in the playoffs throughout his career, because the playoffs are a complete crapshoot. The Marlins have 2 World Series in their 2 real playoff bursts, and we're going to throw out 2020. And look at what the franchise has done other than that. You look at this past season, no one had the Braves winning it all when you got there. It's about getting to the playoffs. And I think that Buck Showalter is the best manager to get the Mets to the playoffs next year. And if you get to the playoffs with a healthy Max Scherzer and healthy Jacob deGrom, I think Buck Showalter is perfectly capable of managing that team to a World Series. I don't think he's going to make glaring mistakes with that type of a team. So you have a veteran manager for a veteran team. I think that's another important distinction here. Is the Mets are a very old team, and if Max Scherzer, who reportedly wanted Buck Showalter to manage this team, if he's bought in, and everyone's going to fall in line with Max Scherzer, and Buck Showalter commands that respect from your top guys, then what are we talking about? This is still a manager that's always been respected by his former players. You've seen Adam Jones rave about him. You've seen others as well. You've seen videos of the way this guy reacts or interacts with his players. I think this is a completely I don't want to say perfect, but it was the hire to make. It was the hire to make for this owner, for this team, for this situation. This was the hire that made sense. And if it doesn't work out, well, I'm not even going to blame Buck Showalter because if it doesn't work out, it's more likely due to players getting hurt because they are in their 30s. And that certainly carries more risk, in my opinion, than the veteran manager does. I really don't think that Buck Showalter is going to have some pitching decision in a big game that's going to mean the difference between the Mets winning or losing the World Series. And if that is what happens, if next year where we get to a playoff situation and Buck Showalter blows it, pull up this clip and I'll eat my crow. But what I think Buck Showalter is going to do for this team is he is going to legitimize them for one. That is something that does have some value here. Buck Showalter is a baseball name that holds a lot of weight, and he's going to legitimize this team. He is going to be the manager, in my opinion, that when there is a rocky start, it's not going to throw the Mets off course. If the players are putting too much pressure on themselves, I think he's the type of manager that can calm the players and get them refocused, which they might not have had this past season. So, with all of that said, I think this hire makes a lot of sense. I think the Mets get the manager that fits this team, and they're trying to win now. So this is another all-in win now type of move. This is a 2 to 3 year window with this team. And as these contracts come out the books, Buck Showalter might not get another contract past this 3 year deal. So you try to win a World Series in this 3 year window. It doesn't happen. Then maybe the next manager is the Joe Espada like hire where you get someone who could manage your team for a decade if the hire works out perfectly. But in this situation, it just makes a lot of sense. And I don't want to just continue to repeat myself and talk in circles. I have discussed Buck Showalter to the Mets on multiple podcasts that I'll put at the end of the feed on YouTube, or I'll put it in the episode description for the podcast audience so you can listen to those as well. But overall, the Mets get the manager who definitely is Steve Cohen's guy. I think we knew that Steve Cohen would be enamored by Buck Showalter, and clearly he was. He broke the story on Twitter. Marcus Stroman, not the only one who can announce their big decisions, their big free agent acquisition type moves. He gets the big name manager. He's going to be a part of a team that's going to be a lot of fun to watch. I think that's another thing that we could talk about with Buck Showalter. The entertainment value is going to be there for Mets fans. He's going to give some good quotes after games. It's going to be just another star in a weird way in this team that's going to be a lot of fun to watch in 2022. Anyway, that's going to be all for this special weekend edition of Locked On Mets. I will have more about this hire throughout the week. I'm sure Buck Showalter will speak with the media. We'll hear what Steve Cohen, Sandy Alderson, Billy Upper have to say about the hire, and we'll continue to move on from there. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan and follow the show at Locked On Mets.